The morning of June 19, 1944, broke across the English Channel, with the kind of gray pallor that seemed to match the weight of the world at war. In a nondescript laboratory somewhere in southern England, a British scientist held up a cylindrical device no larger than a man's fist, turning it slowly under the fluorescent lights. This was no ordinary piece of equipment. This was a magnetron, the technological marvel that had tipped the scales of aerial warfare decisively in the Allies' favor. Unknown to the German High Command, this humble-looking tube represented not merely a weapon, but a complete revolution in the physics of detection itself. The magnetron story began years earlier, when British researchers at Birmingham University had achieved what seemed impossible. By harnessing the principles of electromagnetic waves in novel configurations, they had created a device capable of generating microwave radiation with unprecedented efficiency. This breakthrough, which many historians would later identify as one of the most consequential technological achievements of the war, gave the Allies an extraordinary advantage. Their radar systems could now see through darkness, fog, and cloud cover with a clarity that German pilots had begun to understand, meant their days of surprise bombing raids were numbered. As the Nazi war machine stumbled backward across Europe following the D-Day landings, German military officials became increasingly desperate to understand how the Allies possessed such superior detection capabilities. The Luftwaffe had begun experiencing catastrophic losses, not because Allied fighters were superior in design. Indeed, German aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262 often outmatched their counterparts, but because they were being intercepted with almost supernatural precision. Fighter squadrons would scramble to intercept Allied bombers, only to find themselves already marked and hunted. In the chaos of retreat, fortune smiled momentarily upon German scientific leadership. A Bristol Beaufighter, shot down over German-occupied territory, carried with it examples of the latest Allied radar equipment. When the wreckage was recovered and examined, German engineers carefully extracted what remained of the systems. Among the precious components was a magnetron, the very heart of the technological superiority that had confounded them for so long. The magnetron was transported immediately to Berlin, where it was placed in the hands of Germany's most accomplished electronics researchers. These were not minor scientists, but some of the finest minds in electromagnetic physics in the world. Men who had trained at the Technische Hochschule institutions and worked on wireless transmission problems since the 1920s. The German scientific establishment, which had produced some of the greatest theoretical physicists of the era, now faced a test that would expose the fundamental limitations of their wartime research priorities. The examination began with meticulous care. The Germans' own radar development efforts, centered at facilities like Telefunken and the Reichspostzentralamt, had pursued different technological pathways. They had invested heavily in conventional valve technology and had not pursued the microwave frequencies that the British had pioneered. What German scientists now held before them was not merely a device, but a rebuke. Proof that while they had been perfecting incremental improvements to established technology, the Allies had made conceptual leaps they had completely failed to anticipate. As the physicists studied the magnetron's elegant architecture, measuring its resonant cavities and analyzing its electromagnetic field configurations, a troubling recognition began to crystallize in their minds. This was not simply better engineering. This represented a fundamental understanding of physics that their own research programs had not yet achieved. The gap was not measured in months of development time. It was measured in years, perhaps even a full decade of scientific progress. The British kept the magnetron's presence in German hands very brief. Through their superior intelligence networks, they soon discovered that the device had fallen into enemy hands, and special operations were mounted to retrieve it or ensure it could not be properly studied. But the damage, or rather the revelation, had already penetrated deeply into the consciousness of Germany's scientific leadership. Dr. Helmut Schlesinger sat in the austere conference room of the Reichsforschungsrat, the German Research Council, on a humid afternoon in early July 1944. The papers before him contained the technical analysis of the captured magnetron, compiled by the most authoritative voices in German radar physics. He had called this meeting knowing that what would be discussed here would not be welcome news to the military authorities who had been pressing for explanations of the Allies' radar superiority. The presentation began with Dr. Herbert Childs, a senior Telefunken engineer who had overseen much of Germany's radar development. Childs had the unenviable task of explaining to military officials, men who expected solutions and victories, not admissions of failure, exactly how far behind the German scientific establishment had fallen. His words were carefully measured but ultimately devastating. The magnetron represented not an incremental advancement, but a paradigm shift in microwave generation that German laboratories had not yet begun to seriously pursue. The technical analysis revealed several shocking truths. First, the efficiency of microwave generation in the magnetron far exceeded anything German researchers had achieved using their conventional designs. Second, the frequency stability and output power of the device suggested that the British had solved fundamental problems in cavity resonator design that German physicists had dismissed as theoretical abstractions. Third, and most damning of all, the entire operational philosophy underlying the magnetron indicated that Allied scientists had moved beyond the technological assumptions that had guided German development. What made this admission particularly painful was its timing. The German military establishment had invested enormous resources into their radar programs, particularly after it became clear that radar had played a crucial role in the Battle of Britain. The Würzburg radar, the Freya detection system, and various other installations represented years of development and thousands of technicians' labor. Yet all of these systems suddenly appeared antiquated compared to what British engineers had achieved. The meeting produced an internal report, later discovered by Allied intelligence services, which contained phrases that would have been almost incomprehensible to German leadership just months earlier. The analysts acknowledged that German physics had become stagnant in certain crucial areas. They admitted that while German theoretical physicists remained world-class, the application of theoretical breakthroughs to practical engineering had lagged dangerously. Most crucially, they suggested that Germany was not 2 years behind in radar development, as some optimists had hoped, but rather approaching a full decade of technological deficit. This context is taken from declassified documents found in the National Archives of the United States and the British National Archives, which documented the technical intelligence gathered on German radar capabilities during the latter stages of World War II. The admission created profound reverberations within German scientific circles. If they were a decade behind in one field, what other areas of technology might be subject to similar unknown deficiencies? The thought was paralyzing. Scientists who had been recruited into military research projects now faced the grim reality that their work might be rendered obsolete before it could be deployed. Younger researchers began to comprehend that the technological race had already been lost in crucial respects. To understand why Germany had fallen so dramatically behind in magnetron technology required examining the fundamental physics research that had preceded the engineering achievements. Dr. Wilhelm Bohn, a theoretical physicist at the University of Berlin, found himself tasked with explaining this gap to increasingly frustrated Nazi officials. What had begun as a technical problem had metamorphosed into something far more troubling. Evidence that German wartime science had systematically failed to pursue certain promising theoretical avenues. The magnetron's principle was elegant in its complexity. It consisted of a vacuum tube containing a central cathode surrounded by a block of copper or other conductive material pierced with small resonant cavities. When electrons were emitted from the cathode and subjected to a magnetic field, they would oscillate and induce electromagnetic waves within the cavities. The geometry of these cavities was crucial. They had to be precisely shaped to resonate at the desired microwave frequency. The British had mastered this resonator cavity design through years of patient experimentation and theoretical refinement. German physics, by contrast, had pursued different technologies. Their researchers had focused on conventional triode and tetrode valves, improving them incrementally, and pursuing incremental increases in frequency. This approach had produced functional radar systems, but it had not achieved the conceptual breakthrough that magnetron technology represented. The difference was not merely one of better engineering, but of fundamentally different physics understanding. The tragic irony was that German scientists had actually contributed significantly to the theoretical foundations upon which the magnetron was based. The work on electron trajectories in electromagnetic fields, the mathematical descriptions of wave propagation in metallic chambers, these German physicists had pioneered such work. Yet somehow, the wartime environment had prevented Germany from translating these theoretical insights into practical applications. as efficiently as the British had managed. Part of this failure stemmed from the politicization of German science under Nazi rule. Scientists who had fled Germany in the 1930s had included numerous researchers who might have contributed to magnetron development. The dismissal of scientists deemed politically unreliable or non-Aryan had created a brain drain that wartime research programs had never adequately compensated for. Additionally, the fragmented nature of German research efforts, with multiple organizations competing for resources and authority rather than collaborating toward unified objectives, had created inefficiencies that a more coordinated approach might have mitigated. Furthermore, German research priorities had been shaped by assumptions about how the war would progress. Military planners had expected that radar technology would be less crucial than other weapons systems. Resources had been devoted to rocket programs, jet aircraft development, and other initiatives that were perceived as more strategically important. The radar program, while adequately funded, had not received the intensive focused attention that the British Magnetron project had benefited from. Dr. Bohn's analysis revealed that the mathematics describing cavity resonators had been known to German physicists for years. What had not been effectively pursued was the engineering implementation of these mathematical principles at the scale and precision required for microwave generation. This represented a failure not of theoretical understanding, but of applied physics, the crucial intermediate discipline that connected abstract mathematics to practical devices. This context is supported by historical analysis from the Smithsonian Institution's collection on wartime technology development, which has documented the divergent research paths taken by German and Allied scientists during the Second World War. By August 1944, the reluctant conclusion within German scientific circles was that the path to magnetron development would require not months of focused effort, but rather years of fundamental research that Germany could no longer afford to undertake. The war machine had reached a point where future technological solutions would arrive too late to influence the conflict's outcome. The Telefunken Corporation, Germany's largest electronics manufacturer and a primary contractor for radar research, had to confront uncomfortable truths about its own organizational structure and decision-making processes. In September 1944, executives and senior engineers gathered to determine how the company had failed to anticipate or pursue magnetron technology despite its revolutionary potential. The meeting took place in Berlin, though the city was increasingly subject to devastating Allied bombing raids that made such gatherings perilous affairs. The analysis revealed a cascade of missed opportunities and institutional inertia. In the pre-war years, when fundamental decisions about research direction were being made, Telefunken researchers had indeed explored cavity resonator concepts. However, the company's investment in conventional valve technology, which was more immediately profitable and seemed more mature, had absorbed the majority of available resources. When the war began and military contracts flooded into the company, the existing infrastructure and production capacity became locked into conventional technologies that were too well established to abandon. Additionally, communication between different research teams within Telefunken had been inadequate. Teams working on different aspects of radar technology, on communication systems, and on fundamental electronics research had not been sufficiently integrated. This compartmentalization, which was partly a result of Nazi-era security concerns and partly a consequence of ordinary corporate silos, meant that insights from one area were not effectively transmitted to other teams where they might have stimulated new approaches. The competition between different organizations for Nazi patronage and military contracts had also created perverse incentives. Rather than pooling resources and information to solve common problems, different companies and research institutes had often worked in parallel, duplicating efforts and failing to share breakthroughs. The magnetron represented a catastrophic failure of this fragmented system to produce innovation comparable to what the more centralized and coordinated British research efforts had achieved. A particularly striking factor was the status hierarchy within German engineering. The theoretical physicists occupied positions of high prestige and were extensively published in academic journals. The applied engineers who actually turned theory into devices occupied a lower status in the academic and intellectual pecking order. This meant that the crucial work of implementation, taking theoretical insights and translating them into manufacturable devices, was sometimes assigned to engineers with less influence and fewer resources than might have been optimal. The magnetron's development had required that such applied engineering work be treated with the seriousness and resources normally reserved for theoretical research. The postmortems conducted at Telefunken and other German firms revealed that the company's leadership had, in fact, received proposals for more intensive magnetron research from some of its own researchers. However, these proposals had been evaluated through the lens of conventional engineering judgment, which suggested that the return on investment would not justify the diversion of resources from more established programs. The tragedy was that the evaluation criteria themselves had been flawed, failing to account for the revolutionary nature of what magnetron technology could accomplish. By September 1944, it was far too late to redirect resources toward magnetron development, with any hope of achieving military utility before the war ended. German industry was increasingly focused on simple survival as Allied bombing intensified. Factories were being relocated underground, production was being disrupted, and the trained workforce was being depleted as engineers were conscripted into military service or killed in air raids. The institutional failures revealed by the magnetron examination would later serve as a subject of intense study among organizational theorists and historians of technology. The magnetron case became a textbook example of how even brilliant individual scientists and engineers could fail to produce optimal results when operating within organizational structures that fragmented effort, created competitive rather than collaborative incentives, and failed to recognize paradigm-shifting innovations when they emerged. For the British intelligence services, the capture of the magnetron and the opportunity to observe German scientists grappling with its implications represented an extraordinary intelligence coup. The Bletchley Park establishment, famous for its decryption of German military communications, had also developed sophisticated methods for analyzing German scientific and technical capabilities. When the captured magnetron was recovered before German researchers could fully exploit it, and when intelligence services intercepted reports of German scientists' analysis, British decision-makers gained crucial confirmation of something they had long suspected. The Allies possessed a technological advantage that was so fundamental that German catch-up efforts would be extraordinarily difficult. The value of this intelligence extended far beyond the magnetron itself. The reports from German researchers admitting to being a decade behind in radar physics provided confidence that Nazi Germany possessed no secret weapons or technological breakthroughs that could reverse the military situation. This intelligence reassured Allied leadership that the technological race, while not entirely one-sided, had been decisively won in the crucial area of detection and tracking systems. It meant that the Allies could proceed with confidence in their strategic bombing campaigns without excessive fear of new German technological innovations that might suddenly reverse the air war. More broadly, the German scientific analysis of the magnetron revealed the overall state of German physics research. The frank admissions of stagnation and the acknowledgement of the decade-long deficit suggested that German theoretical physics, while still formidable, had not been translated into practical military advantages as effectively as Allied science had achieved. This intelligence reinforced the understanding that Nazi Germany's war effort was technologically constrained in ways that the regime and its military leadership had not fully appreciated. The intelligence analysis also revealed a paradox that troubled British strategists. How could Germany, which had produced some of the greatest physicists of the 19th and 20th centuries, have fallen so far behind in applied physics during wartime? The answer involved multiple factors: the emigration of scientists in the 1930s, the politicization of science under Nazi ideology, the fragmentation of research efforts, and simple bad luck in research direction decisions. But the fundamental explanation was that scientific progress required not merely brilliant individual minds, but also institutional structures, resources, and organizational coherence that Nazi Germany had not effectively maintained in certain crucial areas. This context is drawn from declassified British intelligence reports held at the National Archives in Kew, London, which documented Allied assessment of German scientific capabilities during the later stages of the Second World War. British scientists and military planners who examined the German reports on the magnetron found themselves in a curious position. They had to resist the temptation toward overconfidence. While the Magnetron represented an extraordinary advantage, the fact remained that German engineers were incredibly skilled and resourceful. If Germany could somehow sustain a prolonged technological effort, despite its deteriorating military situation, breakthroughs in magnetron technology or competing approaches to microwave generation might eventually emerge. The intelligence community therefore recommended maintaining constant vigilance regarding German research efforts in microwave frequencies and related physics areas. The intelligence victory also had diplomatic and strategic implications. The assessment of German technical inferiority could be, and was, incorporated into strategic discussions with the Soviet Union and within Anglo-American planning committees. It influenced decisions about resource allocation for research programs and affected calculations about how quickly Germany could be defeated and whether certain military operations were justified given the technological context. As the autumn of 1944 deepened and the full dimensions of Germany's technological lag became impossible to deny, a more troubling question began to haunt German scientific circles. If the nation had fallen a decade behind in crucial technology, despite possessing world-class physicists and engineers, what did this failure say about the human and institutional costs of Nazi rule? The question remained largely unspoken, for to voice it too openly was dangerous. Yet among thoughtful scientists, the recognition grew that Nazism itself had become a technological liability. The most obvious cost had been the emigration of scientists. When Hitler's regime came to power, many German scientists of Jewish heritage, or those deemed politically unreliable, had fled to Britain, the United States, and other nations. These included some of the most brilliant minds in physics and mathematics. Among the émigrés were scientists who would have contributed significantly to magnetron research or the theoretical physics underlying it. The loss of these researchers represented not merely the loss of their individual contributions, but also the loss of the intellectual communities they would have created. Beyond the direct loss through emigration was the indirect effect of Nazi racial policies on the scientific community. The purge of Jewish scientists and the promotion of Nazi ideological criteria for academic advancement had contaminated the entire scientific establishment. Resources that should have been devoted to scientific merit and research potential had instead been devoted to political loyalty and ideological purity. The system had generated its own inefficiencies and misallocations of talent. The militarization and politicization of science under Nazi rule had also created structural problems. Research was conducted within compartments dictated by military secrecy and organizational jurisdictions rather than by scientific logic. Researchers working on related problems often could not communicate freely because of security restrictions. The theoretical physicists, operating in universities that remained partially insulated from military concerns, sometimes worked on problems that did not connect effectively with the applied engineers working on military projects. Furthermore, the regime had displayed a troubling tendency to pursue technological solutions that aligned with ideological preferences rather than scientific judgment. This had affected various research programs, not just radar. The result was that German technology, while sometimes achieving impressive results in specific areas, had become unbalanced and inefficient overall. Some German scientists, particularly those who had weathered the Nazi period through careful navigation of political pressures, began to contemplate the costs they and their nation had paid. The Magnetron affair had become a concrete illustration of a much larger truth, that the combination of Nazi ideology, political pressure, organizational fragmentation, and brain drain had placed Germany at a severe disadvantage in the technological competition that defined modern warfare. There was also a more immediate human cost. Young German scientists had been killed in air raids, conscripted into military service, or worked to exhaustion on military projects that produced no beneficial results. Research facilities had been destroyed by bombing. The desperation to achieve technological breakthroughs in hopes of reversing the war's momentum had led to unsafe experiments and driving researchers beyond reasonable physical and psychological limits. By November 1944, with Soviet armies advancing from the east and Allied armies pushing from the west, the recognition of technological insufficiency merged with the realization that Nazi Germany faced imminent military defeat. The Magnetron case study had become a microcosm of the larger failure of the Nazi state, a state that despite its technological inheritance and scientific potential, had squandered those assets through ideological rigidity and institutional dysfunction. As 1944 drew toward its close and the winter snow began to fall on battlefields across Europe, historians, scientists, and military analysts began to reflect on what the Magnetron affair revealed about the nature of scientific progress in wartime. The narrative was no longer simply about one technology, but had become a meditation on how nations mobilize science toward military objectives, and why some succeed while others fail, despite possessing comparable resources and talent. The Magnetron case demonstrated that technological superiority arose not from the brilliance of individual researchers, but from the combination of theoretical insight, practical engineering expertise, organizational coordination, resource allocation, and institutional vision. The British had possessed advantages in almost all these dimensions. They had a unified research establishment focused on radar technology, with clear chains of command and coordination mechanisms that prevented duplication and wasted effort. The decision to pursue magnetron technology had been made centrally, endorsed at the highest levels of government, and provided with resources that reflected its strategic importance. German research efforts, by contrast, had operated under constraints that no amount of individual genius could overcome. The fragmentation of effort among competing organizations meant that crucial breakthroughs made by one team might not be known to another team working on similar problems. The prioritization of ideology over merit in the scientific establishment had removed some of the most capable minds from contributing to the war effort. The security compartmentalization, while perhaps justified by legitimate military concerns, had prevented the free exchange of information necessary for genuine innovation. The Magnetron affair also revealed something about the nature of paradigm-shifting technology. The device represented not merely an incremental improvement over existing radar technology, but a fundamentally different approach to generating microwave radiation. Recognizing this paradigm-shifting potential required not just technical expertise, but also intellectual flexibility and the willingness to pursue research directions that violated established assumptions. German physics had been brilliant at perfecting existing approaches, but apparently less effective at recognizing when entirely new approaches might be required. This context is informed by post-war assessments conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and subsequent historical analyses of wartime scientific development, which documented how organizational factors influenced technological outcomes during the Second World War. Military historians began to recognize that the magnetron represented not an isolated anomaly, but a symptom of broader technological trends. The Allies had enjoyed advantages in multiple crucial areas: radar, aircraft design, communication systems, code-breaking equipment, and various other technologies. These advantages had not emerged from raw scientific brilliance alone, but from the effective organization and mobilization of scientific and industrial capacity toward military objectives. The realization grew that Nazi Germany, despite significant scientific and industrial capacity, had actually fallen behind the Allies by 1944 in most crucial military technologies. Where the Germans had achieved superiority, in certain classes of aircraft, in jet engine development, in rocket technology, these were the areas where research efforts had been most effectively coordinated and resourced. Where Germany had fallen behind, in radar, in communications, in production engineering, these were often areas where organizational fragmentation and resource misallocation had undermined research efforts. For post-war planners and strategists, the Magnetron case became a crucial lesson in how to organize national research efforts. The American and British establishments would emerge from the war with detailed knowledge of what had worked in German research programs and what had failed. They would incorporate these lessons into post-war scientific establishments, with implications that would extend far beyond military research into civilian science and technology development. As winter 1944 became early 1945, and as the Soviet Red Army swept across Eastern Europe while American and British forces prepared for their final assault on Nazi Germany's heartland, the debate over the magnetron had become part of broader conversations about the post-war world. German scientists who had participated in the examination of the captured device now faced the prospect of military defeat and were beginning to contemplate their own futures in a post-Nazi world. Some German physicists had already begun to establish intellectual contact with American and British counterparts, attempting to preserve scientific networks across the lines of military conflict. Others were deeply pessimistic, having witnessed the destruction of German scientific institutions through bombing and the devastation that was coming to their nation. The dream of German science achieving new breakthroughs to reverse the war's momentum was clearly impossible by January 1945. The Magnetron affair had conclusively demonstrated a fact that was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Germany had lost the technological race, and by margins that would have been almost incomprehensible just years earlier. The nation that had pioneered so much modern physics, that had produced Einstein and Planck and Heisenberg and countless other brilliant minds, had somehow fallen behind in a crucial area of military technology. The question of how this had happened would consume historians for decades to come. In Britain and America, the victory in magnetron technology was already being recognized as more significant than any single military battle. The technology had been decisive in the air war, enabling the Allies to interdict the Luftwaffe with devastating effectiveness. The fact that Germany had been unable to match or counter this technology, despite the best efforts of capable researchers, suggested that the Allies had achieved a decisive advantage in the technological competition that underlay modern warfare. As the war moved toward its conclusion with Nazi Germany's imminent collapse, the magnetron case had become a parable about how scientific progress occurred, or failed to occur, within the constraints of political systems, institutional structures, and resource allocation decisions. It was a story about the triumph of organizational coherence and institutional vision over raw talent and historical precedent. It was a story about how ideology could corrupt scientific institutions, and how political pressures could distort the allocation of research effort. The captured magnetron that German scientists had examined with such dismay in June 1944 had revealed uncomfortable truths. It demonstrated that the technological inheritance of centuries of German scientific accomplishment could be squandered through political pressure, institutional dysfunction, and resource misallocation. It showed that brilliant individual scientists, working within dysfunctional organizational frameworks and ideologically constrained systems, could not overcome fundamental limitations that the structure of their institutions imposed. By the time German armed forces surrendered in May 1945, the magnetron had become more than a piece of military hardware. It had become a symbol of a crucial turning point in the technological competition that had characterized the war. It represented the moment when Germany's engineers and physicists had been forced to acknowledge that they were not merely behind in one technological area, but fundamentally outclassed in the scientific competition itself. The legacy of the magnetron examination would extend far into the post-war world. The lessons about how to organize scientific effort, how to recognize paradigm-shifting technologies, and how to avoid the institutional and ideological constraints that could cripple scientific progress would inform the creation of post-war scientific establishments. In both the United States and Soviet Union, planners would draw on lessons learned from wartime scientific competition, including the cautionary tale of German scientific failure despite enormous historical advantages and continuing intellectual capacity. The magnetron had proven to be not merely a superior technology, but a symbol of the fundamental causes of Nazi Germany's ultimate defeat: institutional dysfunction, political ideology, corrupting merit-based selection, fragmented organizational structures, and the failure to recognize and pursue paradigm-shifting innovations. In the Cold War that would follow, the lessons of the magnetron affair would continue to resonate, shaping how the Western Alliance pursued scientific innovation and technological development. The humble-looking device, captured on a sunny day in June 1944, had revealed truths about the relationship between scientific progress, institutional structure, and military outcome that would occupy scholars and strategists for generations to come.